Imagine a place with no roads, no phone, no power, just Alaska's Twin Lakes, where winter locks the water into ice and one mistake can cost everything. In 1968, a 51-year-old mechanic, Richard Proenneke, flies in with hand tools and a camera and decides, "I'm staying." What follows is 30 winters alone. Twin Lakes lies in a long fold of land at the base of the Alaska Range, inside what is now known as Lake Clark National Park and Preserve. The lakes stretch narrow and cold between low mountains and tundra flats, their shorelines edged with spruce, alder, and scattered birch. In summer, the light lingers late into the night. In winter, it withdraws early, leaving long hours of blue shadow across snow. There are no roads leading here. Access comes by small bush plane, landing on water when it is open, or on skis when it is frozen. The nearest towns are distant. Weather moves quickly through the valley, rain carried in from the coast, wind coming down from the higher peaks. Temperatures fall well below freezing for months at a time. Moose travel the shoreline. Caribou pass through in shifting numbers. Brown bears feed along the water's edge when salmon run. The lakes freeze solid in winter, then break apart slowly in spring, the ice separating with low, echoing cracks that carry across the basin. For much of the 20th century, this was a place visited briefly by trappers, bush pilots, biologists. Few remained for long. The land does not invite permanence. It offers space, silence, and work. In 1968, one man arrived here with tools, supplies, and a clear intention to stay. Richard Louis Proenneke was born on May 4, 1916, in Primrose, Iowa. He grew up in a farming community where work began early and tools were part of daily life. His father was a well driller and carpenter. From him, Proenneke learned to measure carefully, to repair rather than replace, and to trust the steadiness of his hands. In 1941, after the United States entered the Second World War, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy. He served as a diesel mechanic in the Pacific Theater. The work required precision. Engines had to function without hesitation. Metal parts had to fit correctly. Mistakes had consequences. During his service, Proenneke contracted rheumatic fever. The illness affected his heart and required a long period of recovery. He later credited his return to health to disciplined exercise and a strict personal routine. After the war, he worked as a heavy equipment operator and mechanic in Oregon and later in Alaska. By the early 1950s, he had begun spending increasing amounts of time in remote parts of Alaska, often employed on Kodiak Island as a diesel mechanic for the Naval Air Station. He was known for his ability to repair engines with limited parts and limited assistance. Colleagues described him as quiet, self-contained, and methodical. Alaska in the 1950s and 1960s still held large stretches of undeveloped land. Bush plains connected isolated settlements. Hunting and fishing remained practical necessities in many regions. For Proenneke, the landscape offered something more than employment. It offered clarity. He kept journals during these years, recording weather patterns, wildlife sightings, and daily tasks. The entries were direct and unembellished. He noted measurements, wind direction, the condition of tools. He wrote as someone cataloging a life rather than narrating it. By his early 50s, Proenneke had begun planning for something permanent. He had saved money from years of mechanical work. He had refined his woodworking skills. He had spent seasons in remote cabins owned by others, testing himself against isolation and long winters. The idea of building and maintaining a cabin alone was not impulsive. It developed gradually, season by season. In 1967, he secured permission from a friend, retired Navy Captain Spike Carruthers, to build a cabin near Upper Twin Lake. The land was remote, but not unknown to him. He had flown into the area before and had studied its terrain. He understood the risks, supply delays, injury without immediate assistance, extreme cold. He did not present the decision as an escape from society. He described it as a preference for self-sufficiency and careful living. In the summer of 1968, at 51 years old, Richard Proenneke prepared to move to Twin Lakes. He brought hand tools, basic supplies, and a 16mm Bolex camera. He also carried notebooks, determined to record what he built and what he observed. He did not describe his plan as an experiment. He intended to stay. In late May 1968, Richard Proenneke flew into Twin Lakes by bushplane. The aircraft skimmed low over water still edged with retreating ice before settling onto the surface. Supplies were unloaded in stages: tools, food staples, ammunition, hardware, and personal effects. Each item had been considered. Weight mattered. So did durability. He selected a cabin site near the shore of Upper Twin Lake, positioned slightly above the waterline and backed by timber. The location offered access to fishing, a view across the lake, and enough nearby spruce for construction. The ground was firm. Drainage was adequate. He began clearing brush almost immediately. The first weeks were spent outdoors. He erected a temporary shelter and organized materials. There was no prefabricated structure waiting for him. The cabin would be cut, shaped, and assembled from trees he selected himself. Using only hand tools, an axe, a crosscut saw, chisels, drawknife, he felled spruce, trimmed branches, and began notching logs with careful precision. He recorded much of this work on film, positioning the camera before returning to his tasks. Summer in the region moves quickly. By August, daylight had already begun to shorten. He worked steadily, shaping each log to interlock tightly at the corners. The floor was laid from split spruce. A stone fireplace was constructed with gathered rock. Windows were framed and fitted. By early autumn, the cabin was enclosed. Bush planes still came and went while weather permitted. Pilots brought occasional supplies and carried letters out. But by late September, flights became less predictable. Ice would soon form along the lake's edges. Once freeze-up occurred, air access would depend on skis and stable conditions. As the first sustained cold settled into the valley, Proenneke remained. There was no scheduled departure. The tools were hung inside the cabin walls. Food had been stored. Firewood was stacked in measured rows outside the door. When winter sealed the lake and the last aircraft noise faded, the decision was no longer theoretical. He was alone by intention, and the season would not shorten for him. Once winter established itself over Twin Lakes, daily life narrowed into a set of deliberate movements. The cabin measured roughly 11 by 16 feet. It was small enough to heat efficiently and large enough to work inside during long storms. The fireplace, built from local stone and sealed with careful mortar work, became the center of the space. Firewood consumption had to be calculated. Each log burned represented time spent cutting, hauling, and splitting. Proenneke rose early. In winter, daylight was brief, and he adjusted his routine accordingly. He maintained a steady pattern, checked the stove, clear snow from the doorway, observe weather conditions, then move into outdoor work if light allowed. He cut and split additional wood even when ample stacks remained. Surplus was security. Food management required equal discipline. He had arrived with flour, rice, dried beans, salt, sugar, powdered milk, and canned goods. These were stored in sealed containers to deter rodents. Supplementing supplies depended on the land. Lake trout and grayling were taken from the water using rod and line in summer and through ice holes in winter. He cleaned and filleted fish outdoors, careful not to attract scavengers close to the cabin. Moose were present in the valley, though not in predictable numbers. When he harvested one, the work expanded significantly. The animal had to be field-dressed quickly, meat separated and preserved before spoilage. In colder months, carcasses could be stored in natural freezing conditions. In warmer periods, he relied on smoking and careful drying. Nothing was wasted. Bones were examined for marrow. Hide could be repurposed. He recorded weights and yields in his journals. Spring brought a different schedule. As snow receded and daylight lengthened, maintenance replaced endurance as the primary focus. He repaired roof seams damaged by heavy accumulation. He rechinked log gaps where shifting wood had opened narrow drafts. Tools were inspected and sharpened. The drawknife blade was honed. Axe handles were checked for hairline cracks. He preferred prevention over correction. Water came directly from the lake. In winter, ice blocks were cut and carried inside to melt slowly in containers. In summer, he drew water with buckets. There was no pump. Waste disposal was handled at a measured distance from the cabin to avoid contamination. These routines became automatic. Proenneke also built beyond the cabin. A cache was constructed on raised posts to store food away from bears. The posts were fitted with metal guards to prevent climbing. He built a small dock for easier access to the lake. He shaped wooden hinges and carved spoons from available material. His craftsmanship was visible in small details, tight-fitting joints, smooth planed surfaces, doors that closed evenly despite temperature changes. Filming continued throughout these years. The 16mm camera required manual setup. He positioned it on a tripod, estimated framing, then returned to his work. The footage shows him rolling logs into place, chiseling precise notches, and testing fits with quiet patience. There is no narration in the original film, only the record of method. Isolation did not mean inactivity. Wildlife passed regularly through his field of view. He noted migration timings, ice thickness, the first appearance of certain birds in spring. He kept detailed weather records, wind direction, snowfall depth, barometric tendencies inferred from observation. These entries accumulated into a long, consistent archive. He occasionally received visitors, bush pilots, friends, or biologists passing through. Visits were brief, supplies were exchanged. News from outside arrived in fragments. When aircraft departed, the sound faded quickly across open water or snow. Silence returned. Years developed a rhythm. Summer meant gathering and preparation. Autumn meant securing stores and reinforcing structures. Winter meant conservation and interior work. Spring meant repair and observation. There was no abrupt transformation from one season to the next. Instead, gradual shifts in light and temperature guided his adjustments. Physical health remained a priority. Each day included labor, hauling wood, rowing across the lake, walking ridgelines to survey the area. He believed that steady work preserved strength. His earlier illness during wartime had shaped this conviction. In his journals, he occasionally referenced weight, diet, and endurance, but without commentary beyond measurement. There were injuries, though none catastrophic. Cuts from tools required cleaning and careful bandaging. Strains from lifting heavy logs demanded rest. Without immediate medical assistance available, prevention was essential. He avoided unnecessary risk. When working alone on large structural tasks, he engineered supports and leverage systems to reduce danger. Logs were moved using poles and gravity rather than force alone. As years passed, the cabin became more refined. Shelves were added. A small desk was fitted beneath a window overlooking the lake. Food storage improved as he learned from experience which containers deterred mice most effectively. His systems evolved slowly based on observation rather than sudden change. In the early 1970s, the land surrounding Twin Lakes began to receive increased federal attention. By 1980, the area became part of Lake Clark National Park and Preserve. Proenneke's cabin remained under special arrangement. Rangers occasionally checked the site. His presence was known but largely undisturbed. Through the decades, the most constant element was repetition. There were no dramatic turning points during most years. Instead, thousands of ordinary tasks sustained the experiment. Wood stacked, fish dried, snow shoveled, journal entries written in careful script. Film footage from these years shows a man moving deliberately across uneven ground, pausing to look across the lake, then returning to work. The camera records seasons changing in quiet succession, green hills turning amber, then white, then green again. 30 winters accumulated in this pattern. The cabin, initially raw and new, weathered into the surrounding trees. Its logs darkened. The shoreline altered subtly with erosion and freeze-thaw cycles. Proenneke adapted alongside it, adjusting methods as needed, but rarely altering his core routine. Time did not announce itself dramatically. It measured itself in stacked woodpiles and filled notebooks. By the mid-1980s, Richard Proenneke was in his late 60s. The work at Twin Lakes had not diminished, but the body that performed it had changed. Tasks that once required little planning now demanded pacing. Cutting and hauling wood remained essential, yet he divided the labor more carefully across the day. Heavy logs were repositioned with greater reliance on leverage and mechanical advantage rather than strength alone. Aging in isolation required calculation. There was no clinic within reach by road. Assistance depended on weather conditions and the availability of aircraft. A twisted ankle or a deep cut from a blade could carry consequences beyond the injury itself. His journals from these later years show continued attention to detail, but also shorter entries, sometimes noting fatigue or stiffness without elaboration. He adjusted his routines. Projects became smaller in scale. Maintenance replaced expansion. The cabin no longer required major structural additions, but it needed vigilance. Roof seams were checked each autumn. Chinking was replaced as logs contracted and expanded with temperature shifts. Firewood stacks remained tall, though he no longer cut as aggressively far from the cabin. Efficiency replaced ambition. Visitors came occasionally. Bush pilots landed with supplies or letters. Park Service personnel passed through after the area's designation as a national park in 1980. Friends who had known him from earlier years visited in summer. These encounters were brief interruptions in a life otherwise governed by weather and daylight. When planes lifted off, the lake returned to stillness. Filming continued into the 1990s, though less frequently. Much of his earlier footage had already documented the essential building years. His camera work in later seasons often captured wildlife or seasonal transitions rather than construction. The emphasis shifted from making to observing. Winters felt longer as recovery from cold required more time. Even so, he maintained discipline. Paths were shoveled, ice was cut, meals were prepared with the same measured care. There is no record of dramatic illness during these decades, but aging itself narrowed his margin for error. By the late 1990s, he was in his early 80s. Friends and family members began to express concern about the sustainability of solitary winters. Physical resilience declines gradually, often unnoticed until a threshold is crossed. In 1998, at age 82, Proenneke chose to leave Twin Lakes. The decision was not announced with ceremony. It followed the same practical reasoning that had guided his arrival 30 years earlier. The work had grown heavier. The risks had grown larger relative to his strength. He arranged for transport out of the lake basin. For 3 decades, the pattern had remained steady. Now, the pattern would change. In the summer of 1998, Richard Proenneke prepared to leave Twin Lakes. He was 82 years old. The cabin stood intact, its logs settled and weathered into the landscape. Tools were still arranged in their accustomed places. Wood remained stacked outside the door. He did not dismantle what he had built. Instead, he secured it. Food stores were cleared. Personal effects were sorted. Journals and film reels, decades of handwritten observations and recorded images were packed carefully for transport. These materials would later be organized and archived, preserving the daily record of his years alone. A bush plane arrived on the lake as it had many times before. The aircraft's engine broke the quiet, circled once, then settled onto the water. Supplies were loaded in reverse order of his arrival 30 years earlier. This time, the cargo consisted mostly of documentation rather than tools. He left without public statement. There was no audience. The shoreline did not change at his departure. The mountains remained as they had been in 1968. The lake surface, depending on wind, either lay flat or moved in low ripples. Proenneke relocated to California to live near family. He would not return to Twin Lakes to reside again. He died on April 20, 2003, at the age of 86. The cabin remained standing where he had placed it, facing the water. After Richard Proenneke left Alaska, his cabin at Twin Lakes did not disappear into neglect. It was preserved within Lake Clark National Park and Preserve, where it remains under the care of the National Park Service. Rangers maintained the structure with attention to the methods he used, replacing logs only when necessary and documenting any repairs. His journals were transcribed and later published. His 16mm film footage was edited into documentaries, allowing others to observe the decades he recorded with steady patience. The material does not present spectacle. It shows repetition, skill, and endurance. It shows a man measuring boards, shaping joints, cutting ice, and watching weather move across water. 30 years alone did not alter the scale of the valley. The mountains did not shift to mark his presence. What remains is smaller and more precise. A cabin fitted tightly at the corners, shelves planed smooth by hand, notebooks filled line by line. At Twin Lakes, silence continues. The record he left behind sits within it, steady and unadorned.